now? If we're Episcopalians, how do you have bishops? And they got to figure that out. And so this priest called Samuel Seabury figured out a way to be consecrated as the first American bishop. And he went off to Scotland because the bishops of the Church of Scotland didn't have to swear allegiance to the English crown. And the deal was that the liturgy of the Scottish Church would be used in this new emerging republic. And so that's why we call ourselves the Episcopal Protestant Church. And so Seabury comes back here and he ordains the first American deacons in 1785 in Middleton in Connecticut. And so all of that is, again, using the imagination to figure out a problem. How do the succession of bishops, priests, and deacons, how can that continue without this allegiance to the crown? And they figured out a way to do that. And the influences of ideas of democracy, the authority of the bishop at one time, because bishops in the Anglican Church, and in England they're still called lords, had enormous power and authority. So America wasn't sure we wanted to give that to bishops. So the authority of the bishop was limited, almost like a constitutional monarchy. And the role of the clergy and relationships with the vestry was elected by the congregations. So all of this, ideas of justice and democracy, the balancing of power and authority, all of that was being worked out in our church. And many of the framers of the American Constitution, it's interesting that our formation came from the same people that were creating the American political system. So we have a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies where legislation comes through. And in many ways, I've kind of theory that because we're this little microcosm of the American political society, we can often anticipate problems that the Republic will go through, we go through. And if you think about the culture war and the divisions in our own church in the last 20 years, that may have been a preview for some of the divisions that we are seeing in our society today. That the Episcopal Church is this little experiment. And some things that happen here, and some of the signs of movement and growth, are also signs of where the Republic is going. And so this balancing of the checking of pure power, authority, and responsibility is in the DNA of our church. We're not Congregationalists. There is a balance between the authority. I mean, for instance, when a vicar resigns or retires, the bishop has to approve it, right? So this is kind of a way in which we're connected to the larger church, and that's just kind of who we are. And so it was this worship and order that was very much behind the creation of who we are. And so for the first generation, they worshipped in homes in this community, baptized people. They built a little church over in the cemetery. This font, children were baptized in this font in the old church. This prayer book survived. It was 1834. There was a Bible and a prayer book that survived the fire in the old church in 1880. And so this Book of Common Prayer, this liturgy, the same stories that we read today, people in this community would have listened to those stories, would have used these prayers, and it would have seen them through the Civil War. It would have seen them through the two great world wars. It would have seen them through Vietnam. And so this is kind of part of who we are. It is our keel. It is our anchor. And the stories that we listen to today, they would have listened to, and they would have figured out how this shapes the kind of the church and the being and the vocation of what they were all trying to do as a people of faith. And church and prayer, we're kind of afraid of conflict. But you know what? There's always been conflict in our political life and in our religious life. There was another another vicar here who is a great hero of mine called Homer Wheaton. Homer Wheaton was a local teacher worked in this area in the middle of the 19th century and was ordained and was also a great missionary vicar. And he planted 1848 St. Thomas's Armenia. So it's a daughter of St. Peter's. So there's always been a kind of missionary spirit about this place to look outward and to see the mission of St. Peter's as something that is much larger than just what's going on here. And Wheaton, the conflict that Wheaton was involved in, he was almost elected Bishop of New York. But the conflict in those days was high church, low church. The Anglo-Catholics, the Tractarian movement in Britain was about bringing colors and liturgy and more vitality in worship, right? And some people didn't like that. They wanted the plain black and white stuff, right? And Wheaton was a high churchman. And he was corresponding with John Henry Newman, who was a very famous, who's now canonized. But so our vicar was writing to John Henry Newman in England about the conflict in the wider church. And in the end, Wheaton actually leaves the Episcopal Church to become a Roman Catholic. Right? And he lived in this community until he was 90. But again, conflict, differences, and conscience was always a part of who we are. Right? And that puts in context, 2 years ago we had Bishop Clark Grew preach, Bishop of Ohio, retired, talked about Philander Chase. It's good to go back and look at that video if you missed that sermon, because he talks about, Philander Chase was a piece of work, right? He was out doing all sorts of stuff, and he was not somebody you'd probably want as your neighbor, but he was this vital, he was a man on fire, and he went off, he was working with Native Americans, he went out to the Ohio, he became bishop there, he became presiding bishop, he founds Kenyon College. Amazing stuff. And he was a controversial figure. And we've got his portrait here to remind us that this is kind of part of the spirit and the imagination of what St. Peter's, if we boil down our DNA, this is kind of who we are. And what can we learn from that as we discern where God is calling us into the future? And so this little church in the cemetery served the community for decades. And life changes, things change, the community changes, and now we find ourselves in a kind of different world. But this prayer book and this common worship and that we are one in Christ and these stories that we read and reflect on every day give us food for thought. I preached a sermon usually on St. Peter's Day every year. If you go back, it's online. If you go back and listen to that sermon in the context of what's happening in terms of change of leadership right now, it's a very important message for the community that is named after St. Peter. Because Peter didn't get it right the first time. There's a wonderful way in which the character of Peter develops in the New Testament, right? He's the one who betrays Jesus. He doesn't get it right the first time. But there is something in his character that Jesus, the Good Shepherd, draws out, pulls out of him. Something that he may not have imagined himself. And I see that in the community of St. Peter's. We had this wonderful Lenten series that many of you led. And again, you can go back online. We recorded it. But Betsy Sheekwin talked about how God is in the shadow, using the kind of theology of Carl Jung, right? And we thought that the shadow was something, you're not very proud of or kind of negative and everything. But what Betsy helped me to understand is that the shadow is also about one's potential that's hidden. And for me, that connected with the idea of Peter. That Jesus, in hearing the voice of the Good Shepherd, is drawing out what Peter is to become. And in the reading today, Peter is this enormous figure in the church who is now carrying on the healing work of Christ. And I love the readings today because the readings you've got, on the one hand, the wonderful revelation where from every tribe and every nation unimaginable numbers of the people in their white robes, and their suffering is transformed and they are redeemed. This wonderful picture of the future to which we are all called, right into that personal relationship with Tabitha, right? And the detail of the early church, that she was really important as a person, as David pointed out, the Barbara Lindsay, I love that, of her day. You know, the most difficult profession in those days was making clothes. You know, we go off to, you know, depending on how much you want to spend, Walmart or McLaughlin, J. McLaughlin, and just we buy clothes and we don't think about it. But in those days, to make clothes was really difficult. And so the idea that when she dies, that the community, Peter, that she's dead, and say, but look what she did. Look what she made. Look what she contributed to society. Right? Beautiful story. And he raises her up. She becomes part of that revelation image in their white robes. Right? And that's the church. That's who we are. That's the message that we must proclaim, that the individual is of infinite value, and that we're part of, and we're going towards something much larger. So I encourage you, look at the St. Peter's Day, 27th of January. Look at that sermon again in the light of what we're now facing, and watch Betsy's talk on the shadow and the potential of this place. The other very interesting, I thought, engaging conversation was when Walter Cadet and John Reed talked about where is God on Wall Street. And here you have two executives who are very distinguished in their business careers, talking about the changes in American society that has created this great inequality that we've never seen before. That the chasm between the haves and the have-nots. And they remember a different Wall Street. They remember corporate America where employees were cared for and respected and treated well. And there was a kind of corporate loyalty that in their lifetime and their professional careers disappeared. And John uses the term vulture capitalism. And a way in which I see the impact that has on your lives, you who work there, and how dehumanizing that is, and also how conflicting that is with your religious values. That image of Peter, that the individual for what they do and what they're worth is of infinite value, and that we're all connected going into the Revelation vision, right? That's not the value that is the dominant value in our world and in our country today. And so this creates, this, again, how do we, knowing the DNA of St. Peter's and how we need to be in community, how does that help us to move forward and to make good decisions? So all of that, I encourage you to use the next couple of weeks to look at those videos, to reflect on those in terms of what that means in your own life, and to help to see a way in which that helps us kind of shape where we're going in the future. It has been a really great honor to be your vicar in the last 5 years. This congregation is amazing. And I see enormous potential, not only for what we are doing together here, but the impact of this place in the wider community and the wider church. It has to go on. Amnesia is the great sin of the Bible. And when we forget our own history, when we forget where we've come from, when we forget the wisdom and the experience the ancestors have given us, we get in trouble. And so today is a moment to reflect and to celebrate what we have been given by the ancestors, by Philander Chase and Homer Wheaton, and all the people that were part, and the Dorcases, the little people that contributed and made things that made this place what it is. I've shared this story many times with you, but in my first curacy, when I was, same age as Philander Chase, I was 23 years old, ordained for a church in Belfast, and I had this very experienced parish priest called Norman Barr, who was he had to put up with this young, idealistic curate who wanted to change the world. And he said to me one time, we were standing in the cemetery, and it was a very old parish, being established in the 17th century. And we were standing at a graveside one time, and you had that wonderful smell of the kind of moist, mulchy earth, right? And he said, Albert, people have been burying their families in this place for generations. It's the clergy who are passing through. And again, it was a reminder, it was a great, wise lesson that the DNA of the Anglican Episcopal Church, we don't trust charismatic leadership. We just don't. We have an organization and a system. And you do not create the church in your own image. The church is created in the image of Christ. Right? We hear his voice. We follow where he goes. And, that's who we are. That's how it is. We're part of something that is much bigger. And it's going to be very exciting to see how your deep connection and your values and the connections that you have with the wider church and the Diocese of New York. And I'm not that far away. I'm just, across 2 rivers. Right? 2 rivers. I'm not that far away, but we're part of the same church. And just as the founders had to solve problems and create ways that people communicate, we have the same work. Right? And our prayer book, our ability to be together, our ability to not be afraid of conflict, but to engage it, to talk about the things that we differ, but we're one in Christ, right? That's the important thing. We're one in Christ. So I end with this. Christ be with us, Christ within us, Christ behind us, Christ before us, Christ beside us, Christ to win us, Christ to comfort and restore us, Christ beneath us, Christ above us, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love us, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. Amen. It is so good to see you, and it's not really it's not my final sermon. I'm sure I'm going to be back at some point, right? And next Sunday I will be preaching at the 8 o'clock service, and I didn't want to get Jeremy Jackson up in the middle of the night to come and talk at 8 o'clock, but he will be here. We have this very distinguished expert on climate change, who is our guest speaker next Sunday at the 9:30 service. So I hope that you can be a part of that. And again, one of the great challenges for our world, I believe, is climate change and the divisions and the differences of opinion. And so Jeremy Jackson is going to help us to see what we can do as a community of faith and in our business lives to care more carefully for the planet. So I hope you can come to that. The Sunday after that, we will not have an 8 a.m. service. We will have one service at the cemetery, again, returning to our mother, our beginnings that I talked about this morning. And we'll have Dr. Fish is going to be our guest speaker at Memorial Day. The Sunday after that, which is the first Sunday of June, we're very honored to have the person who's responsible for transition ministries in the Diocese of New York. Her name is Nora Smith. She worked on a parish up north from here. She's a very experienced parish priest, and I think you're in very good hands in terms of working with the vestry and working with the congregation about where God is calling St. Peter's in the imagination of God. So that outlines just a couple of things that are happening next week and in the next couple of weeks. Are there any other announcements? David?
First of all, I won't be here next Sunday, and I would like to, before you all, thank Albert for being a good and excellent shepherd to all of us little lambs here in Lithgow, and to wish him the best with those little lambs in Chestnut Hill. So thank you, Albert. Thank you. Now I have something else.
Of course you do.
Of course. So, our former tenant and a former parishioner here, Vanessa Neumann, has also transitioned. And there was an article in the New York Post this morning. It's not clear whether she's representing Venezuela or representing the Brits, but she's ambassador to one or the other for the opposition government. And the article in the Post this morning started out in typical Post fashion, saying Juan Guaido, if that's how you pronounce his name, can't get no satisfaction. And then it goes on to talk about her 4-year fling with Mick Jagger. And then it becomes hopeful, and she becomes hopeful about a transition in the government of Venezuela. So keep her in your prayers as she continues on that mission. Now, switching topics. I've just been reading the deaf issue of the Episcopal New Yorker, which I will leave in the parish hall for anybody who's interested. And if anybody is interested in later on taking up permanent residence in a site where our original church building was, in the cemetery, please speak with Betsy Battistoni or with me. We would be happy to accommodate you. And I encourage you all to come to the Memorial Day service 2 weeks from today, 9:30 in the cemetery. It's a very moving service. Dr. Fish has a most distinguished background in the military, serving in both Afghanistan and in Iraq. And he is currently the director of the Thompson House in Rhinebeck. And thanks to Betsy Sheeplin, he will be with us this year. He'll be an excellent speaker. It's a very moving service. There's a brass quartet, and no matter what you think about the current affairs and state of our country, this will either shore up your sense of patriotism or reinforce it. And I encourage you all to be there and to invite your friends and neighbors and house guests to join you.
Thank you. Will?
Good morning, everybody. Vanessa Neumann was also on the BBC this week, and it was quite funny to hear a voice which one hadn't heard for a long time, but then one heard in that proximity, and I was thinking the proximity to St. Peter's as well. It's Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers here today. It's important that I say a few words as the senior warden on the vestry and on behalf of the vestry, given recent developments and the joint letter from Albert, Julie and myself as wardens on behalf of the vestry, which you received 10 days ago. I would have said a few words at this service last weekend, but we were at Innisfree, which is a wonderful service for those that haven't had the opportunity to attend. The letter which you all received left some unanswered questions. I'm aware of that. Julie and I have had multiple conversations with members of the parish subsequent to that. And for those that haven't had conversations with us and would like to, please speak to Julie and or myself and or any member of the vestry. I think it's important to emphasize that the vestry, which is 11 individuals, most of whom you will all know, spoke with one voice at the end of what was a long and difficult decision which we took on behalf of the parish of St. Peter's and what we believe are the best long-term interests of this parish. And in light of that vestry decision, and in consideration as well of Albert's changed circumstances, we are now going through this period of transition. Albert has accepted a calling for which he is excited and which we should all be excited for him and Mile in Philadelphia. And whilst the abruptness with which this transition is happening is not necessarily something which we either planned or designed quite clearly, I think the important thing now is to focus on, firstly, celebrating Albert's ministry with us and what he has brought to this parish over the past 4.5 years. Secondly, to enjoy the very short period of time which he has left with us. And thirdly, to wish him and Mile every success and happiness in the future as they take on what comes next. And I'd just like to say that I was part of the search committee which called Albert to this church. There are 3 other members of the current vestry who were also part of that search committee. And it has been an honor and a privilege to serve with Albert. He has brought, I think most people would agree, a vitality and vigor to this church which belies a man of, no offense here, Albert, younger years than Albert, because he has brought a lot of energy to this church. And we've seen that in many things. We see that in the quality of his sermons, which speak to someone of much greater intellect than myself. We've seen it in the confirmation class. We've seen it in the classes that we've had, and Albert spoke about, the Lenten series, for example. And in terms of next steps, I would like to say that we're clearly working on a transition now. So Albert and I and Julie are working on that with the worship committee, for example. We have a celebration next weekend, which will include a celebration at coffee hour after the 9:30 service in honour of Albert and his time here. As Albert said, we've arranged for the Canon for Transition Ministry to visit us the following Sunday, June 2nd. The Canon will speak at this service. She will commission the new vestry, because that hasn't been done yet. And she will meet with the vestry after that service as well. And finally, I'd just like to say that as we go through this process, many of us have been through this before, 5 years ago, we will be forming a search committee. The whole purpose is to find the right direction ministry for this church and the right minister and vicar to lead us forward. And we clearly invite and encourage your active participation in that process. So whether that is raising a hand, having a conversation and letting us know and sharing your thoughts, or actively participating in a search committee or other discussion groups around this, we clearly actively welcome that. That's all I have to say at this point. Please do, as I say, follow up if anyone would like to. And I'll be happy to answer any all questions as best I can. And again, Albert, thank you very much for all that you have brought to us over these past 4.5 years. Thank you.
And also, if you have some questions or things don't connect, please call me. I'm glad to talk to you. I mean, it's very difficult because we're dealing with personnel things, so there's some things that we really shouldn't talk about. But if something is kind of out of whack and you need to talk to me about it, I'm still around for another couple of weeks. So please pick up the phone and we'll have coffee or whatever. But the important thing is, this is kind of, again, this is part of who we are. We trust our vestries. They, for the clergy, represent the will of God. And in that decision, lives are changed. I mean, we've got people like Matt Borsch, who was a kid whose father was called all over the country, and he understands that. So we entrust, it's a big responsibility that the church gives to a vestry to call and also to discern the ending of a call. And that too that's a very difficult role. But we trust that God is still in charge, and that somewhere out there there's another vicar who's going to really enjoy working with you in the same way that I have enjoyed working with you.
I would like to say one word. We all love you, Albert, and go with that love.
Yep.
And I think we've all faced this issue. We'll miss you, but go with our love, because we have loved having you here, and you brought such vitality and dynamism to the church, and we're grateful for that. So go with our love.
Thank you, T. Blessings. Good. Okay, are we ready to Ann Gillis?
You just thank Sarah.
I will.
I wouldn't do it, but I'm a week late because of ministry last week. Keynotes is coming up fast, and we would love to see new articles, old articles, anything you would like to submit will be received with great welcome. Perhaps David Harshall would like to take out an ad for the cemetery. Or I think it would be fitting, perhaps, for Ham and Helen Reserve, illustrious publishers of the Round Table, visiting today. Perhaps telling us how much they miss St. Peter's.
It's great.
But we really would like to hear from any of you who have itchy fingers. Just send me an email, and if you have any, it can be long, short, any length. We'll accommodate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's great to see the Meserves back in church. Welcome back. Yeah, it's great. So thank you, Sarah Ann, for singing again. Talk about transitions. You're about to graduate,
Yes.
and you will be living in South Florida in the fall. So we wish you well, and thank you for being with us. You're very much a part of our community as well. Okay, so everybody's welcome to Eucharist. We break bread, we share, everybody's welcome. And somebody probably needs to let the kids know, if they're probably still in Sunday school, if you nip out, let Marie know that they can come in for a blessing. So we're going to sit during the offertory and listen to a wonderful offering.